So, if you will all be seated, we will dive into our main message, which is the part two of our coverage, I would say, of where the carcass is, written by someone who's kind of an unknown character who went by the moniker of Hiraeth, which, as I mentioned in part one, means a longing for a sense of belonging or a longing for home. And it was written, at least that's when it was copyrighted, back in 2002. And the website where it used to be is now gone. But I managed to save this work off of their website, and I thought it was a very interesting study, and we're going to dive into some things today. And as I said, it is not meant to be gospel in terms of there can be no differing opinion. I'm not stating this as gospel. I'm just presenting this information for our consideration, and we can debate and we can discuss how this fits in with some of our current understanding, and we may decide that there's alternatives we haven't considered. So hopefully you take it in that spirit, because that's how it was meant. So with that, then we'll dive right in with part two. So if you turn over to Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 40. It says, "And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these." Now, obviously, we're jumping straight into these verses and bypassing the empires of Babylon, the Medes and Persians, and Greece at this point of time in unraveling prophecy. So we're all familiar with the prophecies in Daniel and the fact that parts of the image being discussed here represented Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, and Greece. And because it's the iron and clay of prophecy within these latter verses that bog down biblical students into a hodgepodge of many conclusions in world secular history, that we're jumping to this, Daniel's prophecies have only one road upon which secular history stands, fulfilling the second spiritual road of prophecy, and these two roads run together through history at the same time, hand in hand, right? So you have this secular vein in history, and then you have the spiritual road that runs in parallel. So you have two stories unfolding at the same time that are tied together. Verse 40 became the iron of Rome, whose strong feet marched through and into the lands of the Chaldeans of Babylon, Assyria, Persia, and Greece. Rome's name broke the power and hold over the lands held by these previous notable nations, and as the word subdues implies, Rome did many things during its time of power. It conquered, subjugated, disabled, or rendered peoples submissive for a much, much longer period of time in history than the other ancient nations had done, thus covering Daniel's words of breaking in pieces and bruising all these previous civilizations. Later on in this work, we're going to discuss chapter 7 of Daniel, which again repeats these verses 40 to 43, which takes this story into a much larger context. So let's look at Daniel 2:41. turn over to Daniel 2, verse 41. It says, "And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay." So verse 41 now begins to shunt Bible students into unknown territory, which they will begin to shy away from. The feet and toes of the great image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which stood upon the ground in such fierceness, were part clay and part iron, which automatically made the whole structure undermined with an unstable foundation. Now, Bible students have already come to the conclusion that the two legs of iron which supported the torso and the feet became the division in secular history of the Roman Empire itself into Eastern and Western empires, brought about approximately 330 AD by Constantine I, who set up Constantinople as the capital of the Byzantium Eastern Empire. Rome's role as the geographical and political center of the earth was on the decline. Verse 41 tells us that this fourth kingdom emanating from Rome shall then be divided not only into two legs, but also the 2 feet and 10 toes. And these are at the end of the image's time span on earth, which will have a peculiar mixture. The 2 feet and 10 toes are also kingdoms after the Roman manner, but after Rome's imperial power has been divided, which has therefore weakened the structure. So these 2 feet and 10 toes are to be another ruling power, that of the fifth empire in the earth. And this fifth power has to grow out of the iron, because it did not arise and conquer or subdue as the other 4 powers gone before it. It has now taken into itself 2 classes of people, a dominant Roman people and a molding clay people. Let's look at verse 42 of Daniel 2. It says, "And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle." Now, by the time this prophecy arrives at verse 42, one must realize that the power of the iron kingdom of Rome itself has diminished quite a lot. And because we have Roman power divided into 2 parts, that of Rome and Byzantium, west and east, once a power is divided, it can be overcome through weakness and conquered. And it is an historical fact. A nation's disunity from within is very destructive. And what do we see in the United States today? Nothing but disunity. Everywhere we look. We are doomed for destruction. Back to our earlier theme of gloom and doom. Rome itself crumbled from within at first, which made it an easy target for marauding tribes. Warring factions are emerging in verse 42 out of that one kingdom of Rome into another kingdom with a mixture of peoples, which eventually was to become the Roman Britannic Isles and eventually the United Kingdom. Now, prophecy speaks here of the kingdom, which is a single thing in itself with a limiting effect, and not many nations of kingdoms within the continent of Europe. The latter result, many biblical students would have us believe when trying to fit the 10 toes into the European situation, right? And that's what the Worldwide Church of God had always taught, that there would be these 10 nations coming out of Europe, right? And we're all familiar, or most of us are familiar with those prophecies. And soon we'll see very plainly this one kingdom of Roman Britain taking shape from Roman iron and its other people of clay. This one kingdom of the British Isles under Roman rule saw tumultuous times, when the iron marching feet subdued the Celtic tribes therein. Roman rule lasted from AD 43 until approximately AD 409, when the last of the Roman legions were withdrawn from the island kingdom, returning to Rome to protect its native land. Right? So they had become overly extended militarily, and they had to withdraw their forces to protect their own land because they were under attack. And again, you can draw your own parallels, but when you look at the United States, we're all over the place. The deepening of Roman culture in that island kingdom was to bring about 20 years of relative peace amongst the subjugated areas influencing the Britons. They acquired many features of the Roman legal and political systems and of their architecture and engineering. Many excavations by archaeology today have attested to this occupation period, revealing the ruins of fine houses, baths, mosaic pavements, roads, bridges, on and on. To look upon 400 years of Roman occupation of Britain through biblical eyes is to see it also mentioned in secular history, and not to look with an uneducated blindness. We must always remember God rules in the kingdoms of men. Therefore, this history must be noted as an effectual happening. Verse 42 said that this Roman kingdom of the Britannic Isles would be partly strong and partly broken. And so it was, as secular history will attest to. The Celtic tribes with the Picts, that's Picts, who had predominated in Britain before Roman civilization had taken over, some of which, living in the outlying regions, still clung to their native culture. And this culture was going to cause problems again and again throughout ongoing history. The following 400 years from Rome's departure for the British people was to break apart any civilization they had attained, because the strong Roman influence virtually disappeared overnight with the murderous invasions of the Teutonic tribes of Angles, Saxons, and Norsemen. So Britain was partly strong under Rome and became partly broken with the Celts fighting these incoming surges of aggressive peoples. The ebb and flow over the years of these Germanic tribes within Britain brought that kingdom to its knees, indeed at times almost breaking it apart. As the word partly in verse 42 implies, it was not wholly strong, even under the Romans, because of the intransigence of the outlying Celtic peoples. And it was not wholly broken because of the Teutonic invasions. Because in some measure or degree, many parts of Britain escaped these ravages. The kingdom of Britain's history is full of this partly strong and partly broken episodes. Yet all the while, it was building into an empire of great importance. The weakness and strengths in the British kingdom were put to the test most graphically when Rome's iron hand under the guise of its church had periods of dominating its people. From its sovereigns to the lowly person until the undercurrent of rebellion broke forth against Rome. 10 toes. These 10 toes of the feet of the image have been translated wrongly into many versions by many different denominations. And this is the author's perspective, that these interpretations are incorrect. And each of these people have struck by their own interpretations, excuse me, no matter how ludicrous they sound. They stick by those interpretations. Two particular versions stand out the most. Some churches waiting and expecting the 10 nations of the economic European community to fulfill this prophecy. Though as the years roll on, more and more European nations will join this community. But that doesn't matter, it seems. So this version continues to be used. There are still those that cling to that understanding of prophecy. An update of the last count, there are 12 nations who have joined the European Union. The other version of the 10 toes is said to represent a multiplicity of nations to fulfill this role. When the Roman Empire, as such, disintegrated, and in the process of time, 10 smaller nations, answering to the 10 toes of the image, quarreled over the Roman corpse, which laid the foundation of modern Europe, some strong, some weak. The iron and clay, which is partly strong, partly broken, is therefore imperialism and communism. This version also continues with other peoples having attempted to bring unity to Europe, which are organizations as the League of Nations and the United Nations. But failure has underlined both of those. Both of those versions from churches of the 10 toes of iron and clay are grabbing at situations amongst nations during a specific time in secular history. And they don't list the names of the 10 toes. When I was young, I remember one denomination emphatically teaching that there will remain 10 kings on 10 thrones within Europe at the end days, counting at that time King Farouk of Egypt amongst these kings. But he was dethroned, and so there were 9. Biblical prophecy does not rely upon the changing fortunes of nations at any given time, or of where we find ourselves in history, whether it be the 1st century or the 20th, or the 21st for that matter. What prophecy does rely on in secular history is the continual cross-checking from one prophet's story to the other, and a complete repeating result in that history, giving dates, times, and personalities, filling in a line here and a precept there, which then makes a sure picture. The oracles of Daniel show one how a line upon line from one chapter to the next, and a precept, which is a rule of action or doctrine, upon precept, finally builds within his written chapters an absolute truth which cannot be altered to any other satisfaction. The translation of 10 toes keeps to its own pattern, and it is an unalterable point in question, because it is set and lived in secular history over and over again. The 10 toes is another way that biblical prophecy hides its secrets into the last days, making us all rethink and relearn the facts we are to face toward our salvation. These 10 toes are another name for the British Isles or Greater Britain. So let us examine that unbelievable statement, right? The very good, quick, handy book on the state of Celtic Britain when the Romans invaded is Leonard Cottrell's book called The Great Invasion, which has excellent maps showing how the Romans conquered Britain from AD 43. During the advance of the Roman generals and their legions into the Isles, Cottrell explains and maps how Britain was divided up between the greater tribes of Celts. So let's take a look at that. So from the south to north, they read as the tribes Demnoni, and I apologize for my slaughtering of these names. Diratrigus, Regnenses, Cantiaci, Erebatus, Delbini, Catvelavni, Trinovantes, Iceni, Silvres, Dimete, Ordovices, Diciangli, Cornovi, Coratani, Parisi, Brigantes, Salgoye, Novante, Votadini, and Damnoni. And then in the far north, you have Viniciones, I think. And then, and so this lists making 22 tribes in all. Now, other written secular history of Roman Britain also goes on to tell us when and how the iron of Rome finally pushed on and through the Isles, setting up a Roman kingdom. And we find that the Romans separated this land into 10 sections of tribes, or 10 toes of iron. And so we see those in these tribes. So these 10 tribes, or the 10 toes of iron, are Dumnoni, Belgae, Atrabatus, Canti, Trinovantes, Iceni, Coratani, Brigantes, Ordovices, and Silures. So through the years, and the instability in the Isles made it always partly broken under the iron Roman-backed Church of the Saxon Kingdom against the Celtic peoples. And it again retained its 10 separate princedoms in the one kingdom. And those were as follows, right? You had Sussex, Wessex, Kent, Essex, Northumbria, Mercia, Strathclyde, Wales, Anglia, and East Sussex. Now, the invasions of the Norsemen or Vikings continued, and before the invasion of the Danes in 835 AD, the kingdom was reorganized into 10 sections again.
Softer chair to sit in.
So you have East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, Strathclyde, North Welsh, West Welsh, Sussex, Essex, Wessex, and Kent. Sorry, I didn't have that part on the slide. But when the Normans under William the Conqueror from France, south of Britain, entered the British kingdom, with the backing of the Iron Church of Rome, so began another set of 10 toes. But this time, the clay began to mold itself and away from the iron into 10 princes of the house of Israel, who this clay represents. And here we must remember that the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, or house of Israel, had been lost into the nations after its destruction by Assyria. We're all familiar with that, right? They became apostate, kept the feast a month late, and God got sick and tired of them worshiping Baal and sent them off into exile. So they were carried off by the Assyrians. Then over the remaining centuries, each Israelite prince was put in place in this kingdom, from which the royal house today in the 20th century takes its secular genetic lineage and its spiritual lineage. So we have those listed as follows. We have William of Normandy, 1066 AD, and his descendants, Reuben. We have Henry II Anjou Plantagenet, from 1154 AD and descendants, which is Simeon. Henry IV, Bolingbroke, Lancaster, 1399 AD and descendants, Zebulun. We have Edward IV, York, 1461 AD and descendants, Issachar. There's Henry VII, Tudor, 1485 AD and descendants, Daniel, or Dan, I should say, sorry. Then we have James I, Stuart, 1603 AD and descendants, which is Gad. We have George I, 1714 AD to Victoria, 1819 AD, Hanover, Asher. Edward VII, Saxony, 1901 AD, Naphtali. We have George V, 1910 AD to Elizabeth II and descendants, Windsor, which is Ephraim. And then we have presidents of the United States of America from George Washington, 1732 AD, Manasseh, or 9 and 10 are Joseph's children, right? So we have Ephraim and Manasseh as Joseph's children. So the division in power in the two ruling feet took place and became the British Empire and the United States of America. Now, of course, that's a controversial interpretation too, for some people believe that this is a completely made-up fiction in terms of the British American peoples being of the tribes of Israel. And again, it's not necessarily a salvation issue. It's more of a curiosity and looking into one's own heritage and trying to understand where these nations are and how prophecy is evolving. So, the division in power of the two ruling feet took place and became the British Empire and the United States of America, approximately growing at the same time. The British Empire arose AD 1749 to 63, and the rise of the United States in AD 1764 to 88. The house of Judah is counted with their fleshly father Jacob, and not Israel. Though they are surnamed Israel, and part of the nation of Israel, the house of Judah or Jacob contains Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. And then later on in another chapter of this work, the author will explain the deeper meanings of both of those houses and also explain the 10 toes of the house of Israel within the royal lineage. Let's look at Daniel 2:43. Which says, "As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay." So, verse 43 is telling us that considering these things prophesied are so, implying an admission of facts in the word whereas, right? So that term whereas, all those things before are understood to be facts and true. Secular history is now condensed into a few lines representing many centuries. Nevertheless, two things predominate: the power of the Romans and the molding of the Gentile clay of Israel. The iron power of Rome would shift from imperial Rome in the Isles to the power of the Roman Church, which went into the British kingdom and took a stranglehold on its people. The clay representing the seed of Israel, which shall mingle or mix up and confuse, will join in with this new coat of Roman power. And this quote-unquote seed of men is an expression used to denote Gentile powers, or men without the genetic lineage of Israel's children running in their veins. In some of those nations of men in the earth, we see represented in Nebuchadnezzar's dream idol. There are many verses in the Bible giving us the expression daughters of men or sons of men, which always means that they are not counted in the spiritual history set for the children of Israel through the ages. Because the sons and daughters of men inherit only according to fleshly secular possessions. Otherwise, the spiritual secular promises written at the beginning of the Bible for the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Israel's children, could not be seen to be fulfilled in this seemingly chaotic world. All lineages being carried out into and toward our last days and the close of this age. Many biblical students will say, aha, but Jesus was called the Son of Man, and he inherited after the spiritual lineage. The usage of the Son of Man toward Jesus was for the purpose to explain that he was the man Jesus, not the Christ born under the law of the flesh from Eve and through Mary, out of the genetic line of the nation of the house of Judah, who also had other nations in its blood. And for this reason he was a son of man. As the Son of God, which was the second half of him, Jesus inherited after the law of God and became Christ. His flesh also belonged to the promises set for the larger nation of Israel. But he never inherited anything from it, because he redeemed them instead as a nation chastised of God and sold to the pawnshop of nations. Today, many people don't believe in God, nor that his promises were ever kept, which were made so long ago, because there is no prophet or guru in the world, it seems, to guide and prove to us that the promises were indeed kept. And it's this interpretation of Christ, Son of Man, Son of God, when you think about it, if this understanding is true, you have this lineage of man, which are not the descendants of Israel, and then you have Israel, right? You have the spiritual road, and you have the earthly road. And Christ provided salvation to both because he had both of those parts in him. Just another way of looking at it. So they have indeed been strongly kept, these promises that God made, and in a detailed manner, without any doubt. The blindness not to see and understand is ours, and not the chaos which seems to surround God's promises. So let's look at this miry clay and the words of God to enlighten us and prove who this miry clay is. Jeremiah 18:1 through 13 tells us that the Lord told Jeremiah the prophet to go to the potter's house where 2 vessels of clay were made and one was marred. Turn over to Jeremiah 18 verse 6. It says, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as the potter has done, declares Jehovah? Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. The mistake that is made with biblical students to understand prophecy is to misrepresent the words house of Israel. Because 90 times out of 100, it is not referring to the whole nation of Israel, that of the 12 tribes of 2 separate kingdoms or houses. But it would refer only to the northern kingdom of the house of Israel, whose trust was in their city of Samaria and not Jerusalem. And Jeremiah's chapter 18 is a point in question. Look at verse 4 of Jeremiah 18. It says, "And the vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand, and he reworked it into another vessel, as it seemed good to the potter to do." Now the potter, God, made a vessel, house of Israel, from verse 6, who were taken away by the Assyrians and into oblivion with its 10 tribes, within which contained beloved Joseph's children. He who had found grace in the sight of God and is always remembered. This first vessel of the 10 tribes of the house of Israel was marred or injured, damaged, and hurt. And because of the special place in God's scheme of things for Joseph and his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh's seed, within the 10 tribes of Israel, they were to inherit many things. That vessel of the house of Israel, these 10 tribes, they had to be made again. The house of Judah was called correcting the injury and damage that was done at first. That house of Israel as a nation, separate from Judah, had been made a kingdom. Yet it was torn up by the roots and rejected. It was demolished from its glory. It was subverted, overthrown, laid waste, and put an end to. Jeremiah's verses 6 through 10 tell us this and more. Let's take a look at Jeremiah 18, 6 through 10. It says, "O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter has done, declares Jehovah? Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. If at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will pluck you up, or that I will pluck up and break down and destroy it, and if that nation concerning which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I intended to do to it. And if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will build and plant it, and if it does evil in my sight, not listening to my voice, then I will relent of the good that I intended to do to it." And you can see how this is equivalent to the potter forming it into something else. The lament in these verses concerning the second Israelite nation, the vessel of the house of Judah, were being warned from verses 11 through 23 by Jeremiah. What shall befall them also because of their evil ways, when Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was poised to destroy them and their much beloved city, Jerusalem? Let's read Jeremiah 11 through 23. Jeremiah 18, 11 through 23. It says, "Now therefore say to the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, thus says Jehovah, behold, I am shaping disaster against you and devising a plan against you. Return every one of you from his evil way and amend your ways and your deeds. But they say, that is in vain. We will follow our own plans, and will everyone act according to the stubbornness of his evil heart. Therefore, thus says Jehovah, ask among the nations, who has heard the like of this? The virgin Israel has done a very horrible thing. Does the snow of Lebanon leave the crags of Syrian? Do the mountain waters run dry, the cold flowing streams? But my people have forgotten me. They make offerings to false gods. They made them stumble in their ways, in the ancient roads, and to walk into side roads, not the highway, making their land a horror, a thing to be hissed at forever. Everyone who passes by it is horrified and shakes his head. Like the east wind, I will scatter them before the enemy. I will show them my back, not my face, in the day of their calamity. Then they said, come, let us make plots against Jeremiah, for the law shall not perish from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet. Come, let us strike him with the tongue, and let us not pay attention to any of his words. Hear me, O Yehovah, and listen to the voice of my adversaries. Should good be repaid with evil? Yet they have dug a pit for my life. Remember how I stood before you to speak good for them, to turn away your wrath from them. Therefore deliver up their children to famine. Give them over to the power of the sword. Let their wives become childless and widowed. May their men meet death by pestilence, their youths be struck down by the sword in battle. May a cry be heard from their houses when you bring the plunderer suddenly upon them. For they have dug a pit to take me and laid snares for my feet. Yet you, O Yehovah, know all their plotting to kill me. Forgive not their iniquity, nor blot out their sin from your sight. Let them be overthrown before you. Deal with them in the time of your anger. And let us also look at Isaiah 64, verses 8 through 12. Isaiah 64, 8 through 12 says, But now, O Yehovah, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are the potter. We are all the work of your hand. Be not so terribly angry, O Yehovah, and remember not iniquity forever. Behold, please look, we are all your people. Your holy cities have become a wilderness. Zion has become a wilderness, Jerusalem a desolation. Our holy and beautiful house, where our fathers praised you, has been burned by fire, and all our pleasant places have become ruins. Will you restrain yourself at these things, O Yehovah? Will you keep silent and afflict us so terribly? So in these verses, we see the two remnants of Israel, Zion, Jerusalem, acknowledge God as the potter and father of this whole nation of 12 tribes. And they are the clay to be molded into something better. Because of their iniquity in the past, they beg for forgiveness because they are still his people, a nation cut out from other nations to fulfill something great. Now, some biblical teachers say that this reference in Isaiah 64 is toward the relationship of the creation when God made man out of clay. But I'm afraid one can't take a verse out of context and use it in an unlearned manner just to prove how clever one is. Verse 10 explains who is spoken of in Isaiah 64. Zion, the remnant or holy seed from out of the house of Israel. Jerusalem, the remnant or holy seed from out of the house of Judah. All Isaiah's latter chapters are written with these two houses in mind, because both of them will return to God on their knees when the last approaching days of men's ruling on earth has been accomplished, and all men will know how excellent are the Holy One of Israel's ways. And that'll be explained later on, this question of Zion and Jerusalem. So remember, the Bible is first and foremost the secular and spiritual history of the Hebrew nation, who are known as Israelites. Other nations in the earth were and are secondary to this nation until we reach the era of Jesus Christ. Excuse me. When we should have realized that Israel and Judah had been driven through other nations, having to learn hard lessons within them. And then they picking up other nations' genetic lineages also, which they then, through the years, will fulfill two roads in that same history. On the face of it, all seems rather complicated. but the simple flower of majesty dealing with reason opens out into exquisite accomplishment by a creator God. If then we have understood who the miry clay spoken of by Daniel is, then the house of Israel, that out of the house of Israel, we then find they are residing in many Gentile nations. From verse 43 of Daniel 2, the miry clay is counted from Roman imperial times. Then on through history, these people having been gradually entering into the Roman kingdom of the British Isles. The Schofield Bible reference notes the meaning of the words miry clay as baked or brittle. But according to the author, this translation is utterly incorrect and misleading. If one notes well the two words miry clay, it is the opposite to brittle. Let us analyze the word clay. We will find it is a tenacious kind of earth which forms a plastic pastry mixture with water. Miry clay is wet, muddy soil, which, when used to try and daub iron, a hard substance, with this almost impossible mud, it's difficult. A mire is a swamp or a marsh. Iron, the most common and a useful metal used for Rome, metaphorically, hence the meaning for them being harsh, rude, severe, firm, robust, and not easily broken. If, for example, one used an upright bar of iron and tried to daub it with muddy clay, it would slide down the iron, or just fall off in clumps, or come away in your hands. So clay doesn't stick to iron very well at all. So the verse 43 of Daniel 2 is showing us that the seed of Israel shall mingle themselves with the seed amongst men in a genetic manner. Yet they shall also keep themselves separate from them in another manner, which will be spiritual, because within them God has placed another call and another road for them to fulfill. They coming out and seen upon that road in the last days. So because miry clay is wet and muddy for molding purposes, and iron hard and inflexible, they will remain separate for their own inner reasons, which throughout the years secular history has shown us. One must not take offense in any way at these words when we say other nations are secondary to all Israel's position in the earth. This is an historical and biblical fact when God has set them to be so. And by the same token, the Israelites have suffered for their position because they did not measure up to the standards set for them by God. Other nations inherit according to the flesh. And if they sin in this situation, they are forgiven more so than the tribes of Israel. Whereas Israel's sins must be taken into account historically and spiritually. It is the case of noblesse oblige, or persons of noble rank should set an example, and much is expected of them, therefore are laid under obligation and answerable to God, just like the ministry is held to a higher account. And we, as self-proclaimed followers of the one true God, have to live as an example to others. Otherwise, we take that name of Yehovah in vain. If we claim to be his children and we don't do what he says, we take his name in vain. And so Israel has to be held to a higher account. They have to set the standard of behavior, which they've completely failed to do. And so this miry clay or the Israelite people who were being molded by God, were mingled in many nations, as it says, when they were carried away, right? They were carried away and lost, or supposedly lost in history. So they're carried away in many nations, and they were gradually being pushed westward into the isles. And so we must go to the other prophets to visualize this knowledge. The whole book of Hosea, the prophet, gives us a terrible picture of the rise, fall, the scattering and punishments of the house of Israel, headed by Ephraim within the Gentiles in the latter days. Hosea goes into great detail to explain the character of the greater British nation or the house of Israel. Hosea tells us this house has had sovereigns and princes, priests and pride throughout its history. And with that pride, they have transgressed every law of God to this day. One thing they have not got is knowledge from God's words that will set them on the right path to truth about themselves. Knowledge that will free them from their own vain captivity and their treachery against God, brought about by the traditions of men, which are hollow ramblings of nothingness. Look at Hosea 4, 6 and 7. Hosea 4, 6 and 7 says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. The more they increased, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory into shame." Every church within the countries that the house of Israel have found rest and set up nations, who once all resided in the British Isles, feel secure in their various ideas of God and his purposes with us all. But very few people within those churches question what they have been learning because of untruths, building strong habits and nothing more. Hosea tells us what is wrong with the house of Israel today. Let's look at Hosea 8, 11 through 14. It says, "Because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. Were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing." Or the Bible which we study today has been gathered together piece by piece through great people who giving their lives for those words throughout the centuries so that we might read and live forever. Yet we of the 21st century, the 20th and 21st centuries, count the Bible as a small thing with the written words that many say are confusion and misunderstood, sentences too deep to interpret. To read that our ancestors were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Israel, thus calling ourselves biological factual reality for some people. This sounds strange, as if God is incapable of bringing order out of the chaotic nations. Mankind limits the purposes and actions of God down to his own level, calling them outlandish or an odd curiosity, right? We tend to limit what we think God can do and add confusion. And we know who the father of confusion is. Verse 13, "As for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat and eat it, but Yehovah does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt." Or the house of Israel, to whom was given the knowledge of the law and the Christ as a quote-unquote Christian nation, whose head is Ephraim's lineage, were people who from the very beginning to the end of their days do approach God with strange sacrifices. In Israel's early years, they went through periods of immoral worship of other deities, and called it consecrated holy. Through the ages of man, they bowed to idols and sacrificed their own children. In our modern era, the offerings on the high altars of man in wine, wafers, and incense are done by ritual and not much heart. The priests and people alike consume that meat with lowered eyes, hands collapsed, not being fully aware of what an awesome thing it is to approach God in this manner. Better to go through life without touching that sacrifice of Christ Jesus than do it with an empty mind and an empty heart. For these shallow things of Israel's people, he will remember our unrighteousness and injustice, and of these things, sending his angels to be amongst us for evil and not good. The house of Israel was returned to Egypt of the nations as slaves to the usage of other nations into which they were driven and lost. Verse 14, for Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. So I will send a fire upon his cities, and it shall devour her strongholds. Or when Hosea wrote these words, his ministry to the people was after the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom of the house of Israel, from approximately 728 BC. Eventually, that kingdom of 10 tribes ceased to exist, most of the people being taken away from their soil and into oblivion. This nation then started their chaotic wanderings. The house of Israel assimilated into the Western nations and became so-called Christians, leaving their mark in many countries as well as the British Isles. This Christian British nation assimilated and absorbed many pagan man-made customs, foreign from its Hebrew beginnings. They built hundreds of churches of all sorts to worship a God they knew not. They happily by chance existed and grew, believing God was their right. Yet they did not understand their Maker was also the Holy One of Israel, and they the clay of Israel. The house of Judah, or the Jews, were constantly on the move and always hiding from a hand stronger than himself in history, and have tried to hide from mankind within the defensive walls of his synagogues or his traditions and education, forging for himself in the nation's defense walls of respectability. Today in the land of Israel, his fortifications are in his ability to defend himself with walls of weaponry and technology. His additional strength is the right to his knowledge that he's fortifying and defending his own land against his enemies. But as Hosea predicted, because these two nations have not understood their Maker, nor humbled themselves to find truth, the cities of Judah's land will be burned, which past history in Daniel 11, 15, and 16 will show during the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, that it did happen and will happen again in our closing days. The palaces of churches and splendid places of residences built for the so-called humble priests of God within the house of Israel's Christian nations will be consumed and destroyed or wasted with the same fire of destruction. Right? Remember in Revelation where it says they turned on the woman and killed her. So they are going to turn on those religious structures, that religious edifice that exists. Hosea tells us also very much toward our understanding of who and what we are, and gives us so much identification upon matters relevant to our knowledge today. Hosea 7, 7 through 16 gives one the picture of the princes and the nation of the house of Israel during their punishment from the days of the Assyrian captivity through history into our day. Let's take a look at that. Hosea 7, 7 through 16. It says, all of them are hot as an oven, and they devour their rulers. All their kings have fallen, and none of them calls upon me. Ephraim mixes himself with the peoples. Ephraim is a cake not turned. Strangers devour his strength, and he knows it not. Gray hairs are sprinkled upon him, and he knows it not. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Excuse me. Yet they do not return to Yehovah their Elohim, nor seek him for all this. Ephraim is like a dove, silly and without sense, calling to Egypt, going to Assyria. As they go, I will spread over them my net. I will bring them down like birds of the heavens. I will discipline them according to the report made to their congregation. Woe to them, for they have strayed from me. Destruction to them, for they have rebelled against me. I would redeem them, but they speak lies against me. They do not cry to me from the heart, but they wail upon their beds for grain and wine. They gash themselves, they rebel against me. Although I trained and strengthened their arms, yet they devise evil against me. They return, but not upward. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword because of the insolence of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. We read in verse 13 such gigantic words, woe unto them, or the head and the sovereign of this second nation of Israel. For they fled from me. They all have run away from truth and have kept their distance for fear of men's mockery. He said, destruction unto them, though he has given all the princes of Israel and its people power in the earth, from William of Normandy, Reuben, to Elizabeth of Windsor, Ephraim. Yet destruction is your only course because of the evil ways of the people. Because they have transgressed against me, it said. They have violated the law of God and have limited his power. He said, though I redeemed them, right? Ephraim, head of the house of Israel, with all the 10 tribes, were redeemed by a Redeemer, their Lord, Jesus the Christ, who taught them great things out of the Gentile Bible. The Jew of the house of Judah is not included in this chapter because they have not accepted him. And he goes on and said, yet they have spoken lies against me. Right? This Christian house of Israel say they are not Israelites. And God is just God Almighty. They are not surnamed with the Holy One of Israel's name at all. And his promises are not worth the paper they're written on, because they refuse to hear, refuse to subject themselves as they are to their numerous churches with numerous ideas. When the prophet Isaiah, for example, writes of the 2 nations of Israel in the last days in chapter 11, he speaks of them as 2 separate nations. Let's look at that, Isaiah 11:13. Isaiah 11:13 says, the jealousy of Ephraim shall depart, and those who harass Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not be jealous of Judah, and Judah shall not harass Ephraim. The envy or sight of another's superiority, which brings a feeling of grudge and malice. Also of Ephraim, head of the British throne, right, shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. These antagonists and enemies of the Jew shall be brought to an untimely end. It said, Ephraim shall not envy Judah. Right? The Gentile Christian Israelites will stop wishing they could number themselves in secular and biblical history from Abraham, etc., just as the Jew does. And it says, and Judah shall not harass Ephraim. The Jew will not annoy and irritate by little provocations this Germanic bloodline of Ephraim's children, which secular history has proved time and time again of the Germanic anger with the Jew, ending in the Hitler massacres of modern history. There is so very much one can write to prove these two separate nations and their two roles in the earth. But at this point of writing, we must not lose sight of the original point to this chapter, which is putting the miry clay of Daniel 2, verse 34, into perspective. And that perspective takes us into many roads with the miry clay presented with natural dimensions, with positions connected to everything else, and forged into a picture so complete it gives the whole picture a quality and clarity it lacked before. So let us continue with Hosea and into other dimensions to watch that picture take shape. We must emphatically understand that the house of Israel are not contained in the Jew of today that we see around us in every country, nor the Jew in the land of Israel, to which many Jews have gone. The 10 tribes of the house of Israel are in the Gentiles. Look at Hosea 8, 8 through 10. Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel, for they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers, though they hire allies among the nations. I will soon gather them up, and the king and the princes shall soon writhe because of the tribute. So these verses tell us how Israel became swallowed up as a notable people among the Gentiles. They became assimilated, drawn into an abyss and absorbed within many nations that they found themselves in. A clay vessel made by the great potter, they are now amongst the Gentiles. There was no preference or purpose given to them in any way, other than to fulfill prophecy throughout the years. They went into Assyria alone, approximately 140 years before Jerusalem fell, and the house of Judah were taken into Babylon. So completely changed was the house of Israel that it was without roots or a place to call its own. It became likened to the animal called the ass, lost within himself and just living from day to day. The princes of Ephraim compensated their lost identity in temporary measures of service or wages for some fleeting tender affection to lull his senses. So this loss of identity drove them on in the same manner through nation after nation, without purpose for a goal for living. But God, being merciful and remembering their fathers of old, will now gather them again as an identifiable people through their Redeemer, the King of all princes, the Lord Jesus the Christ. Because this nation of the house of Israel became a so-called Christian nation, the knowledge of the full story is the burden or grievous knowledge of identity we all must face before we are free of guilt. Some churches will say Hosea speaks here of the Jew in the house of Judah. This is sheer guesswork. We must ask ourselves, since when did the Jew dwell in Assyria alone? Since when has he been swallowed up in the Gentiles without identity? The strength of the Jew's life and hope was in being a Jew, seed of Abraham. No matter what nations they found themselves in, their Jewishness made them a marked people. Since when did Ephraim and his princes predominate amongst the latter-day Jew? Since when in the latter times did the Jews sorrow a little for Jesus our King? To some of the Jews, he was just a rabbi. To others, an illegitimate child of a Jewess, amongst other things. So let us go to Hosea 9:17. Hosea 9:17 says, "My God will reject them because they have not listened to him. They shall be wanderers among the nations." And then Hosea 11:9 through 12 says, "I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. They shall go after Jehovah. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like birds from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Assyria. And I will return them to their homes, declares Jehovah. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One." In this verse, we see Ephraim's, whose head, he heads all the tribes that went with him into captivity and are counted with him. We see Ephraim's wandering from nation to nation, as the Jew did. In the last days, Ephraim is in the western nations, and he's afraid because they all will find out the truth about themselves through God's anger. The whole of Hosea 11:1 through 12 gives one the whole story of the house of Israel, headed by Ephraim, which nation was headed through the love and the blood of Jesus Christ. The Assyrian, or the power of the ruling of men, that deals only with men's desires and not God's, shall be king over them. Nevertheless, God will not destroy all of Ephraim despite his stubborn and secular ways. Eventually, they will all understand knowledge and tremble from the west because of the truth of his words. Hosea 11:12 sums up the latter-day situation of the two houses of the nation of Israel, of all Israel. It says, "Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit, but Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One." In other words, Ephraim, as the sovereign and last representative from prophecy in the world today for the house of Israel within British stock, moves around, continues and encircles God, but not in truth, because they have violated truth for falsehood, and they call it worshiping God. Ephraim's prince, today called Elizabeth II, well now it's Charles, is called defender of the faith. Which faith is the throne defending and protesting against? Roman pagan Catholicism or high Protestant mumbo-jumbo? Which is it? It is the knowledge of the Israelite faith that Ephraim should be affected with, and the search for the holy seed within the tribes through the words of God, and not centuries of historical and spiritual deception. Because of Ephraim's lies, the whole nation of the house of Israel within British stock, who Ephraim's sovereign represents, also encircled God with fraud, cunning, and duplicity. Ephraim's sovereign became, quote-unquote, defender of the faith because of the desires of secular power and not wholly as a result of spiritual purity. Both Ephraim and the rest of the tribes have lived in well-planned, habitual, lying traditions of men for their own ends, nothing more. A fine example of this duplicity of Ephraim's throne and its people encircling God with lying traditions of men, we see happening in the world today before our very eyes. When one of Ephraim's archbishops of Canterbury, called Dr. Runcie, was preparing to bow the knee to Roman papal supremacy and to recognize the Pope as primate of the Christian churches. Dr. Runcie, also as a shallow priest of God, might be personally reconciled to this duplicity. But the deep divisions of history within peoples and the undermining of the Queen's position as supreme governor of the Church of England are two hurdles not easily surmounted. By some people's reckoning, Dr. Runce's desires were treachery, and to the prophet Hosea's God, it is also treachery. As for the second house within the nation of Israel, that of Judah, though his sins are scarlet, nevertheless, out of Judah came the Messiah, who exercises the rule of power, who is predominant in the government as the redeemer of both houses. Judah, the Jew, though overawed with his own fables and lies of long standing, remains firmly adhering to his duty as a Jew out of the nation of Israel, which resulted in his life always being in jeopardy. Judah of the Jew searches for the Messiah. Oh, he waits for Elijah at his table, remembers the saints Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, etc., adheres to some of the promises and treaties of old, which Ephraim and the house of Israel call old-fashioned, not worth the paper those treaties are written on. In comparison, between Gentile Israel's disbelief and Judah's tears at the Wailing Wall, captured from the Arabs during the 1967 war, there is a gulf. Judah's tears were from the heart, having faith in the words of Psalm 137:5, which says, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill." Other prophets tell us many things about these two nations for identification. Let us read Isaiah 2:5 and 6. Isaiah chapter 2, 5 and 6 says, "O house of Jacob, sons which are the sons of the flesh led by Judah. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of Yehovah. For you have rejected your people, the house of Jacob," Jew, according to this author, "because they are full of things from the east, and of fortune tellers like the Philistines, and they strike hands with the children of foreigners." Judah, found agreeable sensations and emotions which please with the children of men or strangers away from their own nation. They went through the genetic lineages of the colored and other Eastern nations and races, taking into itself the mysterious doctrine of Kabbalah, transmitted by oral tradition, which is the science containing the occult meaning. And they became, as Isaiah says, the Kabbalists are soothsayers of those who predict and define the future, or divine the future, in this mysterious kind of learning, which the God of Israel didn't teach. Kabbalism is Eastern mysticism, wickedness. However, Isaiah 11 through 16 tells us how the two nations of Israel, headed by Ephraim and Judah, will be recovered the second time from Assyria, Egypt, Upper Egypt, Ethiopia, Central and Southern Arabia, Babylon to Persia, northern border of Israel beyond Damascus, and into Lebanon, to the islands of the sea. Look at verses 12 and 13 of Isaiah. It says, "He will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The jealousy of Ephraim shall depart, and those who harass Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not be jealous of Judah, and Judah shall not harass Ephraim." Isaiah emphatically states that there are two houses of Israel, with two heads, Judah and Ephraim, in the latter days. They will become strong in the last days, having been called the second time out of Egypt of the nations. They are called through an ensign, which is a sign or a signal to assemble yourselves together as a flag to give notice of an impending movement. There are many signs to take notice of, and we shall look at them as we uncover secret prophecy. So we're going to pause here in going further with unraveling prophecy from Daniel chapter 2, because out of necessity for our learning truth, much clarification of many paths must be understood to undo years of falsehoods in many churches. So next Sabbath, Yah willing, we will take a deeper dive into this sorry, this path of the second child, as it were. So with that, we will close our formal service for today.